next gentleman who's going to talk to us this afternoon is Mr. Rod Ewert. And Mr. Ewert graduated from Unity High School in Unity, Wisconsin in 1953. He then attended the Gale Institute of Minneapolis, where he learned railroad procedures and telegraphy. He was hired by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad in 1954 as a telegrapher on the Ashland Division, which was headquartered in Antigo, Wisconsin. He later transferred to the Madison Division, where he worked in a number of stations, including Merrimack, Baraboo, North Freedom, Reedsburg, Waniwak, Elroy, and Kendall, so all the up and down the line. He became a trained dispatcher early in 1959 at age 24 and worked at the Wisconsin Division Dispatcher's Office in Milwaukee and Butler for the next 27 years. He later worked in dispatcher's offices in Escanaba, Michigan, and West Chicago, Illinois, before going to work for the Fox River Valley Railroad as a dispatcher in Green Bay. Rod retired in 1993. He and his wife, Kay, currently reside in Oneida Township in northeastern Wisconsin. And so without further ado, Mr. Ewert. With his assistant, Paul Knudsen.
Yes. Well, that's quite an introduction. Hope I can hold up to all this. Paul and I go back to May, where we met at the Adams Chicago Northwestern Railway Veterans Chapter meeting, annual event in Adams. We stayed in touch ever since. Paul, you had...
Yeah, I've got some.
You're gonna, okay. Yes, when I got out of high school in 1953, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I grew up on a dairy farm west of Unity near Loyal, Wisconsin. Farming wasn't for me. My strong subjects in high school were, well, I guess they called them commercial back then, shorthand, typing, accounting. I did look at a couple of business colleges, Madison Business College and Spencerian in Milwaukee, and gee whiz, I looked at the wages accountants were getting back then, and golly, it wasn't much. I thought, well, maybe I'll go on a railroad. Dad talked me into it, and I was a telegraph operator on the Ashland Division, worked a lot of stations up and down the line on the extra board. The extra board is what every division had, and run by the chief train dispatcher, and what you did was fill operators' jobs. Layoffs, open jobs, sickness, death, what have you. And I worked in my life about 35 different locations in Wisconsin. Never had a regular job, but never missed a paycheck. Ate pretty good too. And so when the Madison Division went to Milwaukee in about 1958, there was a kind of a merger of seniority rosters, and Madison was separate from the Wisconsin, but they dovetailed us in somehow or other. And the chief there at that time was Gordon Montgomery from Chicago, that came up to Milwaukee. When Chicago came up to Milwaukee, there was a realignment of offices. Took a shine to me, and I got in the dispatcher's office at the ripe old age of 24, which was unheard of. And usually you didn't get your foot in the dispatcher's office until you were probably 30-some years, 35 years old. But I had a lot of breaks along the way, and I got in. I see Paul has passed out some reduced in size train sheets, which dispatcher worked off from. This was always started at midnight. You started a new sheet for the new day. I don't know which ones you're looking at there.
It's the Madison side.
The Madison side, okay. I would venture to say I worked at least half of these locations here. And I spent a lot of time in the depot in Baraboo. Bill Frank was agent, and Jimmy Pollard was here, Bob Rieger, and a few others. And I lived in Baraboo from 1956 through 1955. And in the later time, I was breaking in as a train dispatcher in Milwaukee. I spent about 6 months breaking in. I had a regular, not a regular job, but I worked off the extra board in the Milwaukee area. And whenever I had free time, I'd go in the dispatcher's office and sit in with a dispatcher, and that's how you learn the trade. And it was quite a long process. And then when you took your rules examination, which by the way was 12 hours, and there was very little written. It was pretty much all verbal. I had 2.5 wrong, and that was, I thought, pretty darn good. Then when you wanted to establish a seniority date, you had to wait for somebody to lay off. They didn't have much of an extra board then, so I paid a guy a day's pay to lay off so I could go to work and get my seniority, and that worked out. Well, I worked extra one day because one of the dispatchers who lived in Adams at that time became ill, and he died. All of a sudden I had a regular job, worked extra, one day on the extra board, and I had a regular job. And I stayed on that regular job, and we had 3 lines. We had the Harvard, what we call the Harvard line, Janesville line. It came out of Chicago, the passenger service up to Harvard, and then up to Janesville, Madison, Elroy, Sparta. That was the end of it. And then there was the Adams line from Butler, or what they call the new line, and that ran from Butler up through South Beaver Dam and Adams to Winona. And then we had what we called the passenger line, the old line, and that was primarily passenger, but there was also a freight line, and that ran from Proviso Yard to Butler Yard, and then Chicago Depot to Milwaukee Depot. And we had to learn all the jobs. And so it took a while. And I got in a jam one time. We had a train that had a shifted load, and it was on double track, and this load was shifted to such an extent that it cocked the signal, and in doing so it created what's known as a false clear. The arm couldn't drop. Clear, stop. The arm couldn't come down. So the opposing train sees this and, of course, struck the object. I spent 4 days at Chicago sweating my butt off in a cramped room with the FRA and the ICC, and they grilled me like you wouldn't believe. And I never was so uncomfortable in my life as sitting there listening or having these people work me over. And they did, they did it. And these were past masters at it. And when it was all done, the general manager of the Northwestern congratulated me at keeping my composure, because there were a few times I wanted to say something, but I bit my tongue. But it was a pleasure to work among these people. Back then, there was a dress code. Everybody came to work in a suit. Suit, white shirt, tie. You were a banker. Came looking like a banker. And in some of these pictures, the one that this gentleman showed here of the dispatcher's office in the depot of Baraboo, you notice they all had these sleeves. They came up to here. And that was because you worked with fountain pens, and paper can be dirty, and ink. And to keep their shirts clean, they all wore a sleeve up to here. And that was one of the things I could never get over. I never saw that before. Now there's not a dress code anymore. That's all out the window. If you look at this train sheet, the versions that you have there, lots of numbers on there. And if you look at kind of the center of it there, you'll see all the stations. To the right side of that, those are eastbound trains. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway might seem to you here, it runs north and south. We have 2 directions. East and south are one, and north and west are the other. So the trains on the right side are all eastbound trains, and they have even numbers. Westbound trains have uneven numbers. And to the right of your station column, you'll see five, I have to put my cheaters on, but you'll see 514, 502, 504, 508. These are all passenger trains. These are all first-class trains. And on the other side, they're uneven numbers, and those are westbound passenger trains. And then on the right side, you'll see second-class trains, 562, 594, and so forth. And those were all second-class trains or extra trains. In my career on the railroad, I don't remember third-class trains. It may have been, I don't remember. They would have been away freight, most likely. At one point in time, after the passenger trains disappeared, scheduled trains also disappeared. We ran extras. Much simpler operation by running extras. And a lot of times, while you did have committed trains, committed to certain products, like 594 out of Madison was meat, but you had certain trains that were committed to certain commodities. And a lot of the times these trains didn't run on necessarily a certain schedule. The meat train did, a few others did, but then piggybacking came in, and you were running extras. As soon as you had a train, you ran it. And so it was much easier to run extras rather than a scheduled train, especially before you had the communication system that you have now. And now it's all different. I would have a terrible time, I think, in a dispatcher's office now because I'm not a computer guru to begin with. And now the computer does all the thinking. The computer makes the meets if you're on single track. The computer does all this stuff. In fact, I've been told anybody in this room can run a diesel locomotive if you know how to set the brake, because the computer does all the thinking for you. You just get on and move the throttle, and the computer takes over, and then all you have to do is set the brake. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. We've got an engineer here someplace, and maybe he could verify that, but that's pretty much how it is now.
They have an energy management system that does that. I mean, the old-fashioned switch engines, anything that's not equipped with PTC and this so-called EMS system, it's still done the old-fashioned way. But as an official policy, the UP wants you to use EMS every possible. If you're on the main line, chances are they're using the management system. It'll tell you when to set the brake and how much, when to release.
Yeah, it's much different than it used to be. It certainly is. We had an engineer at Adams that was not known for good train handling technique. He was not a finesse engineer. And this happened at Butler a number of years back, and 483 was the train, and he had about 200 cars. And that's about 2 miles, roughly. And the yardmaster said, set them up and go. So the engineer started pulling. And we were in the dispatcher's office at Butler, and we were probably a good city block away. And could you hear them go? Bang, bang, bang. And the conductor was always still at cabooses. The conductor got on the radio and he said, you got them all moving, Dick. The stove, the table, the chairs, the toilet. I got a kind of a funny thing happened. A number of years ago, well, everything's a number of years ago to me, but I was working on the Ashland Division in a little town north of Antioch called Monaco, and it was a hot, blistering day, and on a Saturday, the crew was out for something or other on a Saturday. Now, back in the 20s and the 30s, there was a large number of people out of Kentucky and Tennessee that settled in that Crandon, Leona, Argonne, White Lake area. They were called Kentucks. That's where they came from, Kentucky, Tennessee. The revenue agents drove them out. And when they came up and settled in this area, they brought their trade with them, bootlegging. And we had a couple of them that worked on the railroad, the Haynes brothers. and they worked on the track. And they came in that afternoon, and it was blistering out. They sat on the bench in front of the depot. Harlan said to Cletus, you know, I'm gonna go uptown and have me a beer. Is that so? Yep, I'm gonna have me a beer as big around as my wife's leg up by her butt. Harlan thought a while and he says, you're gonna have a half a barrel. And another funny thing, and these are true stories, it happened. One of the dispatchers at Milwaukee married a young lady that came from Genoa, I believe it's Genoa, over on the Mississippi. Where did Laura Ingalls Wilder come from? Wasn't it Genoa?
Alma.
Not quite Alma. Pepin. Her parents lived right next to the CB&Q tracks. And Rick and Bee had just gotten married, so they went home to visit the in-laws. And they had an old house right near the railroad tracks, an old farmhouse. And Rick and Bee slept upstairs. And one of these old beds that had these coil springs, and you know how squeaky they were. Well, Rick was feeling a little amorous, and Bee said, wait till the train goes. Wait. So they're laying there in anticipation, I suppose. And pretty soon they heard the crossing bells. And Rick said, did you hear that? Yeah, she says, the bells. He says, the hell of it was a caboose hop. I think I'm probably outstaying my visit here. If you've got any questions how some of this stuff worked, it was an interesting job because when you came to work in the afternoon or at midnight, whatever it was, the trains were not necessarily in the same place, and you always had different situations. I can remember some awful things happening on a prom night in Footville, about 1956 in fog. 5 high school kids lost their life running into a sand and gravel train in Footville. We had a lot of that stuff. I talked to an engineer one time that ran passenger train between Milwaukee and Chicago. Showed me slow orders that said slow down to 90 miles an hour. But he told me in his career on the railroad running passenger, he had been involved in 17 fatal accidents. People trying to beat a train. And the engineers that are here, or brakemen or trainmen that have been on the head end know exactly what that's like to see a car parallel to you and then thinking, are they gonna turn? And it was pretty scary for a lot of these people. I think the greatest fear a locomotive engineer had was seeing a school bus crossing a crossing or a gasoline tank truck. We had that happen at Eden where they hit a loaded truck of gasoline. Engineer and fireman got burned. I think one of them died in that and the other got burned something pretty bad. So those, you know what I'm talking about. If you have any questions, I'm free to answer. My wife couldn't make it today. She had an emergency. Her daughter from Escanaba had an emergency procedure at Billum Hospital in Green Bay. And so she's up there visiting, and when I leave here, I'm heading for Escanaba. So.
How did they get you familiar with the territory? I mean, did they just throw you into a desk and you had to kind of figure out where the sidings were and the passing tracks?
There again, it was back to sitting in with the dispatcher to learn the territory and then ride. We were compelled to ride our territory twice a year. So you got to pass, you rode with the engineer, you rode on the head end, made notes, and track charts helped you out a lot. But you know, track charts don't tell you a lot of things. You know, you got grades. When I worked, I tried my best to give the guys going home the break. They were laying at Butler for 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours, 18 hours. You always wanted to try to give the guy going home the break. And you couldn't always do it, but I tried to do that. But you learn these things after you make a few road trips and listen to these engineers, listen to them. Of course, a lot of times they're the only one out there, you know. Nobody else is out there. They're the only train out there, and why am I sitting in the siding? Well, when we had a engineer one time that wanted to come in the dispatcher's office. He went back engineering. He said, I didn't realize this is what it's all about, but it took a while, so. Somebody had a, yes.
Did you work Merrimack?
Yeah, I worked for Bob Kingston in Merrimack Depot probably in about 57 or 58.
Remember Jim Larson, by chance?
I know two Jim Larsons, the one that was rules examiner,
I don't know. He was-
telegraph operator.
Yeah, he was at MX and then he became vice president of Amtrak.
Right.
Yeah, he passed away about 6 or 8, 10 years ago. Yeah, he was also, he
He
had,
told me he worked Merrimack.
yeah, he came off the Milwaukee Road to the Northwestern. And then he left the Northwest, he worked a lot of different jobs, and then he ended up with Amtrak. And I understand he lived on the East Coast, and I think he died maybe 10 years ago, more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about Jasper Guess? Engineer out of Madison?
Northwestern man?
Yeah. He ran the last 400 out of Madison.
And he worked the Dakota 400, I think, between Madison and Winona. He was one of the higher up on seniority.
Give me the last name again.
Guess,
Yes.
G-U-E-S-S.
G-U-E-S-S.
Guest,
Jasper.
Doc, Doc Guest?
I don't
I'm gonna
know.
call him that, yeah.
Doc, yeah.
Yeah, he worked
I
really quite
remember,
well. Yeah.
I can't picture him, but I remember. I remember Smokey Stover, quite a few of those guys, none of them are,
Tom Vaughn, I've got him over the
Tommy
road.
Vaughn. He moved the train. Yeah.
Not always on the track, though.
Pardon?
Not always on the track.
Well, no. Another one that got the train over the road was Russ Sullivan. It was, the old man was a conductor and the kid was an engineer. Russ, slug. Big slug and a little slug. Well, if you have no questions, I'm heading for Escanaba.